Hello, happy Thursday. I'm going to do the clue review for last Thursday's game, which was Melon de Bourgogne from Muscadet region. Apologize, it was a little late getting this going. Had a lot of things going on this week. I'm going to go through the clue review, but I'm also going to spend a little bit of time kind of geeking out about what really is Lees aging with that. Sur Lie, Lees contact. Because I think one thing that a lot of wine students do, and I know I did this totally early in my wine studies, was you see Lees, you're thinking autolysis, you're thinking champagne, sparkling wine, or maybe some of the like toasty, buttery Chardonnays. And then you taste Muscadet, Sur Lie, and you're not getting any of those notes on it. And so it can be really, really confusing for wine students. So I really want to talk about kind of what is happening when we see Sur Lie and how it's different and how you should not, especially from a blind tasting point of view, think about Muscadet, Sur Lie in the same context you think of champagne or Chardonnay. Do not think that way. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand why. But let's go into the clues that we gave from last Thursday's game, some blind tasting clues for Melon from Muscadet. So clue 1, green apple. Getting green apple. This is a high malic grape from a cool climate. So I always encourage when you're picking up these notes in a glass, think a little bit about those notes. Don't just write down apple. Really think about, is this more green apple, Granny Smith, or is it a riper apple, something like a Golden Delicious, Honeycrisp? Because those riper apple flavors, or even go bruised apple, bruised apple could be a little oxidation there. There's things going on that's just beyond just apple, and those give you a lot of clues. So take the extra moment, extra sniff, a little bit more time in the mouth to think about what exactly kind of apple it is. So Muscadet, green apple. Clue number 2, lemon, lime, citrus. So still playing up that cool climate region, though. That's what this clue in the glass is telling you. I also like the picture that I chose because it did include with the lemon and lime some turmeric. And turmeric is not really a note from Muscadet, so that's why I added the note there. Don't ignore that a little bit. However, in some examples of Muscadet, you can get that little earthiness, little earthy kind of root veg. Guildsom, which has a fabulous blind tasting compendium of different notes, they included turnips. I don't necessarily get turnip, but you're kind of thinking along those lines. Another kind of earthy, savory note that's also on the Guildsom list is peppery greens. So another thing, just kind of think of something savory with that. Clue 3, green pear, another cool climate note. I also included there in the caption, think about the flesh as well as the skin. You can get a little bit of phenolic notes with that, so that's just something to think about with that. Clue 4, sea salt, minerality. That can definitely, this is a wine region that is very much influenced by the Atlantic. So those are some notes that you can pick up, some of those mineral notes, saline, things like that. I kind of played up on that again with the next clue, clue 5, wet stones, particularly wet stones that are right on the ocean with the sea spray on there. So I asked in that picture, think about what this, picture smells like. What's it like when you're there on the sea? Another clue that can pop up that for some folks with Muscadet is seashell, like licking seashells on that. So think about that kind of savoriness to it. And then clue 6, sourdough starter. And I was very, very deliberate with that. I actually even have here my wife's sourdough starter. We named him Barnaby with that, kind of going around life of its own there. This is different. This smells different than baked sourdough bread. That is sourdough bread that has gone through the Maillard reaction. And so if you haven't got a chance to, get a sourdough starter, and if you do have one, spend some time, take a sniff at it. You do get some of the bread aspects of it, but a little bit of sour, it's lactic from this, but there's a tartness to it and a little bit of almost a neutrality as well. But it's different. It is yeast on there. And so I want to talk a little bit about yeast here with autolysis, but let me get through the structure notes first, and then we'll geek out a little bit about that. So the structure note for Melon from Muscadet, pale lemon, almost watery. So when you have really pale, almost watery wines, this one might also have a little bit of a green hue around it. Now that term, green hue, is not a WSET approved term. So if you're doing a WSET exam, don't include it. But from a blind tasting clue point of view, it is worth noting, like on your scratch sheet, I see a little bit of green in this. So when you get those really watery, pale wines with a little bit of green, a couple things you want to think about. One, cool climate again. You can also think about high yields on there. Wines that are really pushed to the limits of the vines, they're not going to get a lot of concentration on that. And that's both concentration of flavor, but also concentration of color. You also want to think very reductive winemaking, protective winemaking, because as soon as oxygen gets involved there in that white wine, the color will deepen. So if you got a really, really pale wine, this is a wine that has not seen oxygen with that, or a lot of oxygen on it. So that's a big clue there. Intensity, light to medium intensity, kind of erring a little bit towards the light. This is a neutral grape here. Dry, high acidity. Definitely high, spiky acidity. I mean, low pH too. We're talking around 3.0, 3.1 range. Light to medium minus body. Medium alcohol, and on the low end of medium. From the WSET scale, medium starts at 11%, so this is above 11%. But if you think of like a basic Muscadet, its maximum is 12%. And now when you get to some of the higher levels there, or definitely the cruise, you might be 12.5 to like 13%, but it's definitely more on that lower side of medium on it. And so those are the structure clues. But the big ones, let's think about with the lees contact on it. Oh, actually, one other clue before I get too far. Sometimes, especially with basic Muscadet, you might get a little bit of slight effervescence to it. Traditionally, that came about with Muscadet, not a little bit like Vino Verde, but not quite, because this grape, Melon, is so neutral, not a lot going on. So producers wouldn't rack it after its first fermentation, after fermentation's done. So when fermentation's done, you have your gross lees, all those lees that kind of fall out of the wine after fermentation's done, like first 24 hours, that's the gross lees. Usually rack it off that, and then what comes after that is your fine lees. Traditionally in this region, they wouldn't even rack it off the gross lees. They would leave it over winter, cool in the cellar, not much going on with the grape. But those gross lees, those bigger lees, they trap a little bit of CO2 from that fermentation. And if you didn't rack it off it, you didn't basically degas the wine. So when you immediately bottled it afterwards, after a couple months there in the winter, there was a little bit of CO2 left and a little bit of prickle. So that was the tradition there. And it kind of helps maintain freshness. CO2, carbon dioxide, is a protective. It helps protect the very, very limited aromas that are in the wine. And so now you might have some producers, and again, this is usually more of the basic level, that when they bottle it, they'll potentially give it a little spritz of CO2 just to maintain that freshness. And that's the same thing that's happened in Vino Verde. Nowadays, if you're getting a little bit of bubbles in your Vino Verde, it's intentional at bottling, just a little bit of CO2 there. So I just wanted to leave that note there because it can pop up, in a blind tasting. You might get a little bit of that. All right, but let's talk about the big boy, lees on there. So let's start with autolysis. We know this very well when we're thinking about champagne, sparkling wines, thinking about all those toasty, bready notes, nuttiness to it. Those autolysis notes, those are coming from the breakdown of the cells. Okay. Most wine students know this, pretty good. But think about what makes that happen. What is making that is a reaction, cells breaking down on it. It's a chemical reaction. So things when that's happening, you need the right conditions and you need time. And sometimes if you don't have the right conditions, you need even more time. So think about what we have going on right now in wine with like Muscadet. We have a low acid solution, low pH solution, or high acid solution, low pH. Always mix those with that. So high acid, low pH. That is not necessarily the best conditions for things breaking down. You also have low temperatures, either like in the cellar traditionally or in our stainless steel tanks that are nice and cool. We lower the temperature. Think about high school chemistry. When you lower the temperature, do reactions speed up or they slow down? They slow down. Autolysis is a slow reaction. Now in sparkling wine, you have those same conditions. You have that low pH, high acid. You have those cool cellar caves conditions there. But you do have a little bit of an advantage in pressure that is in that bottle that is happening. Think about when you're at home cooking and you have a pressure cooker that can kind of speed things up if you wanted to break down things. You're making, pork for carnitas, stick it in a pressure cooker, breaks it down with that versus long, slow cooking with that. We don't have that pressure situation with Muscadet sitting in a stainless steel tank on it. Definitely not in the small of the bottles. So sparkling wine has a little bit of an advantage there in the autolysis with speeding it up because of that pressure. Now, even then, those conditions, a little bit more ideal conditions, autolysis still takes a long time. You know, if you read some of the books like, you know, about sparkling wine, you know, a lot of producers, 18 months at least is when you start really getting some of those autolysis notes. You can get a few, like, you know, like you think of Cava, minimum 9 months. Well, Cava has a little bit higher pH that kind of helps it along, you know, from those riper grapes there in Spain. But even then, you're not really getting a lot of the autolytic notes. You might get some more of the texture components on it. So autolysis, for the most part, really years. You know, champagne, they talk about, you know, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years on there. It needs time. It's not going to get this time in Muscadet. In Muscadet, basic AOC Muscadet, they start bottling it like March 1st after harvest. So like 6 months with that is, you know, often there. And wines that are labeled Sur Lie, even 10 months. You know, that might be the max that it would get is 10 months. In fact, actually, they have a rule that it has to be bottled, I believe, by the end of November following harvest. So it's not going to get a lot of time. Exception, some of the crus on there. They can get a little bit longer, like Clisson, around 24 months. That's its minimum for that, so they could go longer. Le Palais is 18 months. So longer time, you're more likely to get a little bit more autolytic notes. But for basic Muscadet, Muscadet Sur Lie, no, you don't have that time for it. So what's the point? Why is it on the lees? What are we getting from it? The big thing is, when you think about lees, lees are a really, really good scavenger for oxygen. There's a risk with keeping a wine on its lees too long without stirring it up. Like if you go to Burgundy, they want batonnage, stir it up. They want to avoid reductive flavors coming from it because lees suck up all that oxygen and then you can start getting some of the sulfur compounds that are coming up. So it's a good oxygen absorber. When the cells start breaking down, they release reducing enzymes and some antioxidants. So a good way, this will really oversimplify things, but a good way to think about it, when you think about antioxidants, we think about all our skin creams, skin on the surface. It's one of the first things that break down, releasing the antioxidants. That's a little memory device there on it. So oxygen protection. When you have a very neutral grape, you want to protect it from oxygen because you don't have a lot of aromatics that you're playing with, that you're cooking around. So those aromatics, when they get oxidized, they go poof. So you need to protect what precious aromatics you have. So that benefit of being on the lees is really, really good for that. Lees will also absorb color, so helps get a little bit more of that paleness to it. It's also why with red wines, winemakers often be a little bit careful with the time on the lees because you don't want to soak up too much color from your red wine. And as it starts to break down a little bit, we do get some of those manoproteins coming out, polysaccharides there, that will bind to things that help soften the wine. But again, you need some time. So those wines that only spent a few months on the lees are not going to get as much of those textural notes as wines that spent a little bit longer with that. So again, very, very different than when we think about with autolysis. So kind of rush through things a bit to give you that whirlwind tour of lees, contacts, Sur Lie, and autolysis. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to geek out further with you. Don't hesitate to DM us. And with that, I will start getting going on today's game. Have a good one.